I would like to invite Professor Dr. Christine Eniu to present her welcoming remarks. She is the Provost and the CEO of University of Nottingham in Malaysia. Professor Christine.
Dr. distinguished professors, Tuan-Tuan dan Puan-Puan, selamat datang ke University of Nottingham, Malaysia campus. Particular welcome to our Kuala Lumpur Teaching Centre. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to welcome you to the Centre for Islamic Business and Finance Research's inaugural lecture delivered by Professor Dr. Abbas Mirakhor. And we've just had a very interesting flavour of some of the issues that he'll be covering in his lecture shortly. And my colleague, Dr. Nafi Salam, will tell you a little bit more about that in a few minutes. It's, I think, very timely that we have this inaugural lecture now. We've heard of the great success of the recent World Islamic Economic Forum in Dubai, and that's highlighted the importance of Islamic finance and business worldwide, and it's also drawn attention to the massive future potential. And of course, again, it's interesting that a year ago, WIEF was in London. This year it's in Dubai. It's headed by a Malaysian. And of course, the Malaysian Prime Minister, Datuk Seri Najib, also, of course, a Nottingham alumnus, I think spoke very eloquently during WIEF about the importance of the Islamic economy, and particularly, from my point of view, about the importance of education and research. I think it's important that we remember that the developments we're talking about, of course, do have broader relevance beyond the Islamic world. And again, we've seen the growth in Islamic finance in centres such as London, which aspire to challenge somewhere such as Kuala Lumpur. And I think it's interesting to see how both centres are developing. And one of the things that we've seen in London has been some of the strength in terms of education and research. And that's a challenge to us in KL to try and outperform and to continue to excel in this area. And that's one of the reasons why I'm particularly pleased that at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia campus, we've been able to establish the Centre for Islamic Business and Finance Research. And this is a group of colleagues who will work in a multidisciplinary environment at our Malaysia campus, but also in partnership with other organisations globally, as well as within Malaysia. They'll work with academic and business entities to drive forward an agenda around teaching and research in relation to the Islamic economy. And I'm particularly pleased, as somebody who comes from a marketing background, to see that their focus is not just on Islamic finance, important as that is, but that the focus is much broader on Islamic business, on halal business, on halal branding. This centre started early this year with support from our strategic research funds at the university. We are blessed with a community of very enthusiastic individuals, and Dr. Naf is leading that community. And I think there is huge potential for that centre to contribute to enhanced understanding, enhanced learning, and to deliver research that will be relevant to the longer term development of the Islamic economy. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, great pleasure to welcome you here today for this inaugural event. My economics is a little bit rusty, having gone over to marketing, but I for one am certainly very much looking forward to hearing the lecture today, and I hope you will enjoy it. You'll hear more about that in a second, but welcome again, and a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Christine. Now I would like to invite Dr. Nafis Alam. He is currently the director of the center and an associate professor of finance at University of Nottingham, Malaysia campus. He will be telling you about a brief overview of Professor Abbas Mirakhor's achievements and will be introducing Prof. Abbas Mirakhor's lecture today. Dr. Nafis.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning everyone, and thanks for coming this morning to attend the first lecture of the CIBFR, Center for Islamic Business and Finance Research. We are very privileged to have Prof. Abbas today. Before we introduce the speaker for the day, I would just like to highlight why we are having this session today. If we look into the Islamic finance, this year has been one of the most successful years for the Islamic finance globally. Apart from the humble beginning of CIBFR, which I can say that we established this year we have seen that Islamic finance has gone into more mainstream finance. We have seen institutions like Goldman coming into the Islamic launch of sukuks. We have seen small countries like Liechtenstein going into Islamic sukuks. The issuance of sukuk has gone beyond any level. It has been the highest number of issuance of sukuk by volume as well as by currency in this year, and this year has been the tremendous growth for Islamic finance. So it will be very apt if we look into the future direction of Islamic finance. Now we have seen a lot of research as well as talks on Islamic finance, but what would be the best if we have the most pioneered and most known person in the Islamic finance, Prof. Abbas himself. We are honored to have him here to give the first lecture. Let me give a brief introduction about our speaker today. All of you know Prof. Abbas, so you don't need any introduction, but for the sake of the general audience, Prof. Abbas is the first chair of Islamic finance at INCF, and he has a very long, distinguished career as an academician and a contribution to Islamic economics and finance. Prof. Abbas graduated from the Kansas State University in USA, where he received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD in economics degree. And Prof. Abbas has worked as a professor of economics at the A&M in Alabama, and he also worked with the Florida Institute of Technology. In 1984, he joined IMF in Washington, and he spent 24 years with IMF, serving as the executive director and dean of the executive board, retiring in 2008. During his time at the IMF and from the beginning, he has been championing the research in Islamic finance and Islamic economics. For his contribution, Prof. Abbas was conferred the Order of Companion of Volta for service to Ghana by the President of Ghana in 2005. In 2003, he also received the Islamic Development Annual Prize Award for Research, Islamic Economics, one of the highest and most prestigious awards in Islamic economics. He shared that award with Dr. Mohsin Khan from the IMF as well. He was conferred with the Quaid-e-Azam status by the President of Pakistan in 1997. Without further ado, let me introduce Prof. Abbas to you for the talk today.
Bismillah wa fi sabilillah wa ala millati Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Madam Prof, Honorable Dean, Professor Alam, Brother Aoun, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for that introduction. I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and University of Nottingham for inviting me here to the inaugural session of the center, and I wish the center all the very best in promoting Islamic finance. I thought today we'll have a discussion about the origins of finance first, and then a bit about the origin of Islamic finance, to see the relationship between the two. What I will argue about is that there is something called the ideal conventional finance, and there is an ideal Islamic finance. If in their ideal form they are instituted, they will converge in their results. In other words, they are not two different systems in terms of the results they achieve. They may have different bases of development and basis sets of assumptions, but the infrastructural and institutional structure that ideal finance assumes is very close to what we would expect for Islamic economy. As you know, finance is part of the whole economy, and the way you think about the economy as a whole also reflects on the financial system that operates within that whole. Now, conventional finance is embedded in conventional economics. As I said, there is an ideal system, but there is an actual system in place. There is an actual conventional system, and there is an actual Islamic financial system. The Islamic financial industry is embedded within the conventional financial system in actuality. The reason for that is because in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a realization that there is a market failure in finance. You have a market failure when there is demand for a product and that product is not available in the market. So the market has failed to provide the supply to meet this demand. The recognition was that there are Muslims all around the world, and that Muslims need a way of financing that will meet the requirement of non-interest operation. So the market was there, but it wasn't being met. So bright individual entrepreneurs began to work to try to find ways and means of satisfying this demand. And because most of them came from the conventional background, it was very easy for them to reverse engineer all the instruments of the system of conventional finance and then basically call it Islamic because it avoided appearance of interest rate mechanism being involved in allocating financial resources. Now, of course, since then, there have been some movement away from this, but not yet enough. You know, the whole of Islamic finance has a 30-year operation history, and it has a long ways to go to catch up with the accomplishment of the other system, which is some 450 years old. So it's not all hopeless, but there are problems. In the Islamic finance area, there are a lot of constraints on the Islamic finance industry that will not allow it to achieve the objectives of its ideal system. The ideal system has a litmus test. The litmus test for an Islamic finance industry, which is corresponding to the expectations of the ideal system, is that it will have financial inclusion, that it will help alleviate poverty by financial inclusion, and that it makes sure that you have efficient allocation of resources from the surplus units to the deficit units in the economy, in the real sector of the economy. In other words, whatever credit is going to be created and expanded in the society will go to finance real economic activity. So we say there's one-to-one mapping between the elements of the finance structure and the elements of real sector structure. So you have for $1 of assets that you create, there is $1 of liability, and that asset is real asset, meaning that it's in the real sector of the economy. Obviously, you can see the implication of that is that you have low unemployment and you have low inflation and so on and so forth. We can talk about these later. But right now, we want to see this proposition that present Islamic industry comes from the conventional finance and that it carries some of the problems of present structure of finance. Where does it come from? As we argued that basically any financial system belongs to an economy. And that economy, right now, the conventional economic system is thought to have originated with the classical economists, and Adam Smith, of course, is called the father of modern economics. But unfortunately, the last 20 years of research has shown that perception of the economists in early 1950s and on from understanding what Adam Smith was actually saying was quite different from what Adam Smith had said or had intended to say. There is a British philosopher, Vivian Walsh, and he said that what economists have understood from Adam Smith is actually a vulgarized, his word, vulgarized version of Adam Smith. Why? Because Adam Smith had two concepts. One that economists latched onto. One was the idea that laissez-faire. Laissez-faire basically means that government leaves the economy alone and let it do whatever it wants. And the idea that the economy has to be self-organized, and a self-organized economy driven by basically the self-interest of the participants in the economy will coordinate all the economic decisions, and you will end up with an optimal arrangement for resource allocation, production, investment, and so on. But the fact is, the last 20 years research has shown this is not the picture which Adam Smith had drawn. As you remember, Adam Smith actually has three major works. One, of course, is Theory of Moral Sentiments. 16 years after Theory of Moral Sentiments was published, his book on Wealth of Nations was published. In the middle, he gave a lot of lectures which have now been collected, called Lectures on Jurisprudence. Now, present-day Smith scholars believe that all of these fit together and they are part of one whole unit. What they suggest is the idea that came out in Theory of Moral Sentiments laid down the institutional structure of the economy which Wealth of Nations was describing. And in this economy, the institutions, meaning rules of behavior, relied on virtues that actually you can find in Theory of Moral Sentiments plenty. And these virtues, of course, included justice, included sympathy, empathy, it included trust, it included all of these were part and parcel of the vision of Adam Smith for the economy in which Wealth of Nations was to be embedded. So the idea, when you read Theory of Moral Sentiment, the ideas come actually from much earlier periods of time, from scholastics. We had a lecture the other day about distributive justice. There is, for instance, he chooses, Adam Smith chooses one particular term called the author of nature, meaning God. He says the author of nature actually has laid down these principles, these virtues for humans to follow, and then from that comes rules of behavior within the society. For instance, truthfulness, integrity, all of these things come from these virtues that God has provided. And then humanity is moving toward its own perfection. And that there is a cooperation, co-evolution between the society and humanity. Individuals within the society learn from the society, society learns from individuals, they move together hand in hand, provided that they work with these virtues and have rules that follow or come from these virtues. And he is then, just like somebody like St. Thomas Aquinas had done much earlier, where he assumed there was a divine law. In fact, not he assumed, he believed it, that there was divine law and there was universal law that was based on divine law, and then we had natural law, which was based on the universal law, and then human laws. Natural laws, of course, depended on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or God in the terminology of St. Thomas. There were actually these old principles that were laid down by the Creator to have people follow, and that these natural law provided natural rights for humanity, because God, according to his discussion, God had created humans in his own image. Therefore, they had to be treated with human dignity, and human dignity means that there were some basic needs of humans that the society had to provide. So again, this was the idea that Adam Smith reflected in his theory of moral sentiments. Of course, it was refined a bit later by people like Grotius, a Dutch who lived between 1583 and 1634. Basically, the idea was, from his point of view, that the author of nature had provided these natural rights. But these natural rights had to be provided by the society collectively through social contract. So basically, Adam Smith's idea was you had to have these institutional structures in place before the economy which he envisioned in Wealth of Nation could be operative and could reach optimality. And self-interest that he was talking about was self-interest which was in operation within this institutional structure, within these rules of behavior. But the economists just picked this idea of self-interest and the idea of self-organization and the idea of laissez-faire and put it all together, came up with a new version of their own understanding. But Adam Smith, which was the center of the classical economics ideas, basically did say that an economy which is self-organized, provided it is within this framework, it would reach the most optimal or the optimal arrangement that you could get, meaning that every person's self-interest would be satisfied, and that would coordinate all activities in the economy. Now, this idea was something that was picked up by a branch of economic thought called the neoclassics. Neoclassics were basically trying to prove the classical point of view, that a self-organized economy will operate optimally, meaning that resources are going to be allocated optimally, production will be optimally arranged, and so on and so forth, which follows. And this was mathematically and rigorously proved. The most elegant proof of classical ideas comes from three actually people, Arrow, Hahn, and De Bruyne. The Arrow, Hahn, De Bruyne model of this economy actually shows optimization of social welfare. That is, the welfare of the entire society will be optimized, provided these conditions prevail in the economy. The difference between the position of Adam Smith and position of Arrow de Bruyne was basically that whereas the work of Adam Smith is descriptive, placed within the general framework of theory of moral sentiments, and by the way, his lectures on jurisprudence explain how what God in his word, author of nature, had in mind could be applied by humans to set up laws that would in fact operationalize the principles that he had seen within this ethical moral framework of the economy. But these things were abstracted from. Arrow was to say later that basically he took it for granted that trust will be there, that people's integrities will be intact, all of that. So he took those institutional arrangements on board. And recently, in 2013, Arrow actually complained bitterly about the lack of ethical moral framework within the society and within finance. Now, what Arrow did himself in 1971 in a set of lectures or set of papers that he put together called Theory of Risk Bearing, he said that given the optimal framework that you can get from the classical economy, which he and De Bruyne proved, he said, given that framework, he asked a basic question: how should the risk in a society be allocated? The result that he came up with, he said, if you have an economy which is self-organized, in this economy you don't have set prices, you don't have predetermined rate of interest, for example, that all returns to assets will be unknown, will be contingent to the activities of these assets in the real sector of the economy. So there was nothing predetermined about a rate of interest. Classical economists had argued that there is a rate in the market in finance. In other words, they saw finance as an intermediary between surplus deficit units, but finance's major option or major action was to channel financial capital to real capital into the real sector of the economy to increase production. But what happened during in the view of Arrow was that in such an economy, if you do not have predetermined rates, then the contingent assets, meaning assets that will be traded in the market, will have a rate post operation of production and sales. And you never knew what that rate is going to be until actualized. And so basically, given that the fact that this was a sort of an economy in which everybody took risk according to their ability to bear the risk. So therefore they were sharing the risk of finance operation and production. Risk sharing was actually a tenet of neoclassical economics. This work was done in 1971. However, during that period, we had huge deregulation, and there were reasons why it got deregulated. But you had deregulation of commodity markets, real economic activity, and also deregulation of finance. Deregulation of finance unchained finance. Finance was chained from 1920s all the way, especially after the Great Depression, because many people thought that the Great Depression was brought on by excesses of finance. So finance was reasonably well regulated, chained. But deregulation unchained finance. And it brought on what Keynes had already warned us about in the 1930s, that basically unchained capitalism is a capitalism which produces two evils. His words, not mine, two evils. One was huge, massive unemployment. Second was skewed income and wealth distribution. His word again, these are two evils of capitalism unchained. But the villain, two evils with one villain. The villain of the piece is the interest rate mechanism. Why? Because interest rate mechanism constrains the operation of saving investment coordination. And that coordination becomes a major problem in capitalist economies which is self-organized and is unconstrained, unfettered. Why does that happen? He says, first of all, even under best of circumstances, in a self-organized economy where individuals are making economic decisions, savers and investors are two different people. There's something called, which was the cornerstone actually of assumptions of classical economics, was Say's law. Say's law says, in very briefly, it says supply creates its own demand. Meaning that as people work, they receive income, but they use this income to buy the things that the firms are producing. And so therefore you always have this balance, this equilibrium between supply and demand in the economy. Keynes' idea was that doesn't work that way. Keynes says law is not valid. The reason it's not valid is because there are leakages. One leakage is of course savings, because as soon as workers receive their income, they save. Once they save, the same amount of money is not returning back to the firms. What you need is somebody in the middle to bring, in financial intermediaries, to bring savings into investment, put it back into the economy. And that is coordinating activities of two different people with two different sets of motivations. No one can guarantee that their actions will be coordinated so that savings and investment will be equal. So what savings leaks out of the economy will be injected into the economy by investment. You can be sure that sometimes investment will be greater than saving. You have inflation, sometimes you will have saving greater than investment, and you have recession, which leads to depression. Therefore, it's impossible for a capitalist economy that is totally unchained to bring about a full equilibrium to the point where there is full employment. Therefore, it is incapable of producing full employment. Secondly, the interest rate mechanism creates a situation where the rent itself is a rent. The class that demands it is a rentier class. The rentier class doesn't work. Basically, it receives this rent and sits back and does what, and it then dictates to the rest of the society. You either pay me this fixed rate of interest plus the principal at a set time, or else I'm not providing this money, so we can't put it back into the circular flow of income. Here was a major problem of capitalism. Not only the rate itself made coordination between saving and investment very difficult unless you bribe the rentier class with the rent they are asking for, you had another problem. Interest rate compounded in the hands of rentiers accumulated. The accumulation created this problem of maldistribution of income and wealth. The wealth of the rentier kept piling up, and this is, of course, also the message of the most popular book published recently called Capital in 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. If you have a chance, please look at it. It's formidable, 670 pages, but it is worth reading because it really brings Keynes's warning that as early as 1930s to life. Basically, you see that 1% of the population is receiving, in most of the industrial countries, is receiving 60% of the wealth, or 65% in some cases, 80% of the wealth. And the rest of the society, the other 99% have to share the rest of it. So, and this is all because unchained, the capitalism was unchained after 1975 and so on. So then here comes 75 with unchained regulation on financial structure. New theories come up. Remember what Arrow was saying. Arrow basically was saying that you have to have an economy that operates on equity. That if you do, in other words, if you invest in projects, the return to your investment will be contingent on how well these projects work. Therefore, you're taking a risk, you're sharing risk. And therefore, the only contingent instrument in the hands of the people will be equity shares. What happened after 1975 was new developments in theory of finance. One of these developments was, as all of you who have read anything about finance, you remember, is Modigliani-Miller theorem. Modigliani-Miller theorem about indifference within the capital structure between the equity and debt made Arrow's assertions that the economy has to work with the contingent liabilities, therefore with equity, made it appear that you would still get the same result if you actually operated with debt as well. So at the same time that this came out, another theory came out. This was, of course, theory of efficient market hypothesis. Efficient market hypothesis said, no problem, there's no really much difference between equity and debt. Why? Because in a market which is self-organized, the argument went, in this market, there is no problem with information asymmetry. Nobody has information that somebody else doesn't have. Whatever prices appear in the market are reflecting the full information that's available about the product being sold. So it's okay for you to develop debt instruments without violating Arrow's theorem about risk bearing. So the people started actually devising derivatives at the same time. These things happened within a matter of like 5 to 7 years. These new theories came out. Something came out called the spanning theory. Spanning theory's argument was, if you have one basic instrument, you can span it into many, many different instruments. I like to use an example. Those of you who have seen peacocks, you see how when they spread their wings, they span it. The base is one, is the tail, only one base, but it spans into this beautiful, colorful span of feathers. And this is exactly what happened to the notion of spanning, which really gave rise to development of the derivatives. So if you have the proposition there's no difference between debt and equity, and if you have the proposition that it doesn't matter really what kind of instrument you're talking about, there is no possibility of moral hazard, there is no possibility of arbitrage, you have no possibility of asymmetric information. Therefore, these two are the same. They are going to do, debt and equity are going to do the same thing. And then you have theory of spanning that gave rise to all the derivatives on a basis which had no or very little relationship to the real sector of the economy. So for all practical purposes, classical economics idea of finance as being an intermediary between the real sector of the economy and the finance sector. The idea of neoclassical economics, that what Adam Smith has in mind for a self-organized economy can only come about if all the instruments and all the assets in the economy are indeed assets that are contingent to operations and success of economic activity. That whole thing was totally reversed and something else came into being. What was then, what this led to was something which Nobel laureate James Tobin in 1984 called paper economy. And he argued that where we are going, remember this is 1984, 9 years after 1975 and some years after Keynes's warning that you will soon see development of a casino capitalism. Casino capitalism basically means a speculative economy. So paper economy, James Tobin was arguing that this paper economy is going to have a financial structure that the only thing it does is basically trade in paper. In 2012, remember this is like 5 years after the start of the crisis, 2012, the data showed that annually New York Stock Exchange has trading worth $33 trillion. Imagine the number, $33 trillion annually at the end of 2012, which is 5 years after the crisis. But out of this $33 trillion, only 0.8 of 1%, which means $250 billion, only 250 went to creating new investment and capital accumulation. In other words, going to the real sector of the economy. 99.2% of it went into trading papers. In other words, buying papers which was debt-based, which had no relationship in the real sector of the economy. And basically, people bought it, traded, turned it over rapidly. So it's a speculative economy. So a paper economy is an economy where its finance goes mostly, or largely, if not all of it, goes to speculation rather than creating real economic activity. Paper economy. So what has happened is that what has been created is no longer a risk-sharing economy, but a risk transfer economy. Now, to manage risk of a society, you can do three things. You can transfer it, you can share it, you can shift it. So when you actually transfer, we do risk transfer when you deposit money in your bank account. You transfer the risk of your money to the bank. The bank transfers the risk of that to the borrower. But the trouble is that this regime of risk transfer sometimes changes, switches. So you have regime switching from risk transfer to risk shifting. In other words, risk shifting occurs when two participants in a contract shift the risk of the contract itself to a third party who has no idea that risk is being taken on his or her behalf and has no consent. No knowledge, no consent. So this is what happened at the end of the crisis of 2007, 2008. The risk was shifted to the taxpayers without their knowledge and without their consent. What is happening is basically even after the crisis, again, risk transfer is about to become risk shifting again. In other words, if there is a huge crisis, you now have this mountain of additional debt instrument being built on a very small base of real sector economy. Real sector is producing roughly around $60 trillion worth of GDP for the world, and the total debt, net debt of the world, global world, is way over $500 trillion, meaning something like pretty close to 5-6 times as much. People who disagree, they tell me that it's even much larger than that because you're not counting a lot of the contingent liabilities. Where you have, if you take total liability, for instance, total debt of the United States is 300% of GDP. 300% that means you have, for every dollar you produce, you owe $3. So can you imagine if you were an individual, nobody would lend you money. This is what Joe Stiglitz was arguing. That if I were sitting in the World Bank or IMF, and somebody came from a country and described to me this country's situation, financial situation, and that happened to be the United States, I wouldn't loan him a penny. And he was wondering why countries like Malaysia and others are still loaning money to the United States, because there is no basis, there's no way that all the debt can be validated, because there isn't enough income being produced. So here is where we are ending with the system which is in place now as a conventional system which is operating on risk transfer rather than risk sharing, which was the idea of classical economists and new classical economists. Now we move on to what happened to Islam. As I said, Islamic finance developed. Those of us who started working long before there was anything called Islamic banking. There was no Islamic banks, for instance. There was one that started after 2 or 3 years I had been working in Geneva by Prince al-Turki, Turki al-Faisal, who took all of his own personal wealth and put it in a bank called Dar al-Mal al-Islami. And this bank was operating purely on risk sharing. In other words, the only thing you could deal with is mudarabas and musharaka, pure risk sharing. And it was successful up until the time when there was another very famous, I won't name it, but it was Al-Baraka Group. They came into the operation and used the present conventional system, developed a kind of transactions that was nominally Islamic, but in reality didn't do what Islamic finance would do. So that Darul al-Islami went out of business. Since then, we've had this sort of semi or quasi-Islamic system, where basically the only thing that they considered was non-interest, no interest. But the epistemology of Islamic finance has roots in the Quran, and the Quran basically argues in Surah Baqarah, verse 275, that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants the society to do, wants people who are undertaking economic activities to do, is to base their operations on exchange, al-bay', but make sure that there is no riba in this operation. In other words, there is no possibility of earning something for nothing. That is the principle of operation. Now, from the time of the classics, we have known that whenever you have exchange develops two major characteristics. One of it is division of labor, the other one is a specialization. But as that develops, risks have to be shared. If you can imagine, supposing I am a farmer and I'm producing 10 different products for my uses. This includes beef, includes lamb, includes chicken, includes, let's say, barley, wheat, and everything. And you're doing the same thing. But I can produce sheep much cheaper and much more efficiently than you can produce. You can produce wheat much cheaper and more efficiently than I can. So you set aside your own specialization in producing wheat, which you can do very well. And I do sheep, I can do all my resources go into it. Now both of us will end up having more. The society made up of the two of us is now much better off than it was before. But what have we done? in specializing, I have to take the risk that you are going to provide what I need, you and all other members of the society. You take the risk that I'm going to be able to provide everything you need. So what have we done? We have really shared the risk of the entire society together. So every school of thought believes that, quote unquote, humans are social animals. In the Quran, it's absolutely clear that you live in a society. We are destined to live in society. And therefore, a society will prosper where the risks are shared. And it will not prosper if somebody just takes everything, all the gains, privatize it, and socialize the risk of his operation, which is what happened as a result of 2000, not only 2007, 2008, but 1997 crisis in this part of the world. Andrew Sheng has this wonderful book that he covers all of these socialization of risk and privatization of gain. My money, your risk, he says. My money, your risk. So the real ideal finance would be Islamic finance, would be risk sharing. The ideal conventional finance is a risk sharing finance. If they both operate on the basis of their belief system, which was laid down by Adam Smith, not necessarily being, even religious, but follow the precepts that Adam Smith laid down. If you call him a father of economics, then at least follow the precepts that he has laid down. And if Islamic finance follows its ideal system, they will converge to the same thing. Now they don't, and there are a lot of problems. So Islamic finance has grown, and it will continue to grow. The predictions is that 20% a year. This is the minimum I have seen. Growth for the next 5 to 10 years. If that happens, this means that right now you have $2 trillion of assets, Islamic assets in the world, and you have another 2.5 to 3 billion in halal industry. Put together, you have 5 trillion. 2 trillion and 3 trillion makes 5 trillion. 5 trillion of Islamic-oriented financing and economic activities in the world. And if they grow at 20%, basically means that in every 3.5 years, the size of the asset doubles. So here is to 2014, by 2017 you should have 10 trillion, and it goes on and on. So the idea is, though, that, as we said, the litmus test of Islamic finance we do not see. The reason is that basically the second condition, you have a necessary condition and sufficient condition. Necessary condition is risk sharing, sufficient condition is that you don't have interest operation. The interest operation has been taken on board, but not the risk sharing part. So you have sort of an incomplete message. You have a warped message that comes to Islamic finance industry. But there are problems that industry itself faces. One, that it basically is operating within an industry in which there is no level playing field between interest rate and return to equity. All the advantages are going to interest rate, therefore you have a problem of lack of level playing field. Then finance industry has no instrument with which it can hedge its risk. In the conventional finance, the way financial institutions hedge their risk is by using treasuries, bonds that governments put out. And these are long-term bonds, and so they can always, so financial institutions use them in order to hedge their risk. In Islamic finance, you don't have any of these instruments that are long-term, low denomination, traded in the secondary market, that are issued by governments and are risk sharing. So they don't have, so they're following in an industry which is completely equipped with handling long-term risk. And there is another problem, is that whatever sukuk, so people say, well, but there are sukuks, but whatever sukuks that are issued, these are large denominations. They are not they're not traded in secondary market because anybody who buys them owns them. And therefore you don't have, normal individuals do not have a way of hedging their idiosyncratic risks, their own individual risks that they face. So all of these problems, plus additional political problems that the industry faces, are things that have to be worked out between now and inshallah within the next 10 years, where governments actually will issue instruments with which to finance their own, say, development budget. If we took all of the development budget and which constitutes somewhere between 35 to 45% of emerging market developing countries' government budgets, and actually put them into a portfolio and issued a derivative, equity derivative, and then sold it in the secondary market, then you solve a lot of these problems. You can also then carry that out to carry monetary policy on the basis of using these instruments. I think I've talked enough. I see that one thing about me is I can easily put people to sleep. And not only I'm boring, but the subject is boring too. I guess we'll wait for questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Abbas. The floor is open for any questions.
Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture, Professor Abbas. I have some questions. One is in the area of accounting, for example, we have the concept of time value of money, which I frequently do not see in this discussion of interest. So I was wondering if you could tell me, tell me a bit more about, how, is there no concept of time value of money, or is it absent, or what? Yes. The second thing is, interest today is very much driven by the central bank or government desire to manage the economy. And so, can we have a situation where we have a total absence of interest because it has become an important tool of managing the economy? So does the government not use that tool, or how is it? Yeah, those are the two things. Thanks.
Thank you for these questions. They're very important and very interesting. On the first question, time value of money. Remember, the minute you start talking about time value of money, you're talking about future. So the question is, why should money have a positive value in the future? I'll give you an actual example. Earlier we were talking this morning about the same thing. It is called time preference, the value of time preference. Is that if I save money, saying that I'm saving it in order to earn more money in the future, that tells you that I am considering the positive time preference, no time value of money. I'm considering it as positive. But what if you saw me spend 120% of my income today going and shopping all the time? Do I have a positive time preference? Is my money, does it have a positive value in the future? I'm saying no, actually it's negative. It's not even zero. So what I'm saying that in the future my money is worth less than it is today, because I'm spending it today, I'm not saving it for the future. So what economists have, the economic theory models that we do have mathematical models showing that actually no, it can be negative, positive, or zero. It doesn't have to be positive, it can be negative. So for instance, we have data on consumer spending in the United States. Just before the crisis, it was 107% of their income. In other words, they were spending 7% more than their income. So that meant that they said the time value of money for them is negative 0.7. If you really want to simply look at it intuitively. So, but here we say something else. We say, no, there is value to time value to money. But this time value is not known, just because we're talking about future. So we are saying, why not put your money in investments that will determine your future, what the value is? Because you're talking about, you cannot right now say that the time value of money for me is such and such interest rate. Which interest rate are you going to apply? government itself has a variety of interest rates. You mentioned, this is the second question you have. Well, for instance, you have now the rate, overnight rate of Bank Negara is 3%. So that's the rate. Which one will you take to be your, and then your saving account gets 2%. And government borrows at 6 or 7%. So which one of them is the value of money? Which one will determine the value of money? If you have an inflation of 3%, but you're getting 2% of your saving deposit, actually your time value of money is negative 0.1. So it can be negative, it can be positive, it can be. What determines it is the nature of the economy and your investment. If the economy is returning like it is in this country, 6%, why should you end up with 2%? The time value of money in this economy is in fact what the money does in the economy itself, but not in the future. Because money has to go to investment. Investment takes time and to produce goods and services to be sold, and then your rate of return will determine. So it isn't that in Islam they are saying there is no time value for money. There is. The trouble is that it is not known. That's the only argument we have. It's not, and we can't determine it. There is no way for you to determine what's the time value of money. Is time value of money 100% or more than 100%, which now people who invest in building high rises, they get, according to what I understand, in Malaysia, especially if you're investing downtown, you have something like 100% return. They say, I don't know how much finance gets, but they say 100%. Or is it 10 or 15% that you can make in real terms in the real sector of the economy? So this term structure of interest rate, meaning that depending on the term of involvement of your money, the time value of money interest rate can change. So interest rate cannot by itself determine what's the time value of your money. Again, because it's in the future, we don't know it. Because we don't know it, we say, why don't money be allowed to go and do what it is supposed to be doing, meaning to facilitate production, and let the rate of return be determined later. This is I hope that it may say, if I haven't been able to explain it, please let me know, because I can find another way of explaining it. Silence is
Second part of the question.
The second part of the question, again, you say you have two problems now. We just talked about one. You have a rate of interest which is determined by Bank Negara at 3%, and one determined by the government in its borrowing. It isn't necessary for the central bank to set a fixed rate of interest. The reason it isn't is because if you went with risk sharing, then instruments which the central bank uses will be instruments whose rate of return is not known ahead of time. That means monetary policy has to be tied to the events in the real sector of the economy, much more closer. But let me explain something here. You know, the reason that the central bank sets the rate of interest, it's a floor for the banking and financial system itself, in the cost of capital and in the payment to people who provide them capital, financial capital. The reason the central bank does this is to create an incentive for the real sector people, in other words, consumers and producers, to adjust their portfolios. So if the central bank decides that there is inflationary pressure because people are spending too much money, it raises this rate in order to send the signal to the private sector people not to spend too much and not to invest too much because there is inflationary pressure. On the other hand, if there is recession, it reduces this rate to create an incentive again for portfolio adjustment. Whose portfolio? The private sector. Who is the private sector? Consumers and producers. What we are saying is that in this system, this signal doesn't get through. Look at all the QEs. There's quantitative easings that have been going on everywhere, including the United States. The fourth one they went through, and they don't know whether this one, they have now decided they're going to curtail it, but it's not nobody is sure that this decision is going to be sustained depending on how the real economy reacts. Why do these quantitative easing? Because the ordinary monetary policy that releases credit into the economy is not working. Why isn't it working? It's because the signal is sent to rule the financial sector. Financial sector's objective function is different from the policymakers in the central bank. And therefore, if they don't want to invest, they don't want to loan money to consumers and investors. They are doing it, of course, in a lot of countries just to consumers, but it's not going to investment to create jobs, to create additional production. Therefore, you have to do this further quantitative easing, massive release of credit into the economy, but still the financial sector is not responding. What it does is actually more or less they are deleveraging, and most of the industries and banks in most of these Western countries are now actually highly liquid. They're sitting on trillions of dollars worth of money they have set aside, but they're not investing. So you cannot then create incentives with this system of setting interest rate. What you do is actually create divergence in the economy. You're forcing the banks to go out there and loan money to consumers. And so you have, right now, if you look at the data here, consumer debt is increasing at a very rapid pace. A country which, after the 1997 crisis, reduced overall level of debt in the economy to around 25%. Now, the debt of the government itself is reaching its constitutional ceiling of almost 58%. Constitutional ceiling is 60%. And why? Because basically you are trying to continue to create incentive for the private sector to invest so that people can go to work, but you can't do that. You're talking about maybe I can increase consumption, and when inventories go down, then maybe people will start reacting by producing more. But it doesn't happen. What the risk-sharing system says, why don't you raise this money to government? Why don't you, instead of borrowing, internally when you borrow, who do you borrow from? Borrow from the rich, because the middle class and poor cannot do that. They don't have excess money to loan to you. So you loan it to rich, who also have major shares in big financial institutions. When you do that, you have to create further problem for income distribution. Why? Because you have to tax in order to pay for the interest on the borrowed money. But who do you tax? Rich people have ways of getting by, avoiding your taxes. Who pays? Salary earners whose check comes through a system like teachers. And taxes is lifted right from the top. But those who can get away with it won't pay. Generally, in all societies, the burden of taxation is mostly on the poor and middle class. So you worsen the income distribution. On the other hand, we say, why don't you just take this money that you need for your operations? Let's say, for instance, right now the total debt of the US, of Malaysia is something like 60 billion. People are saving 240 billion, they're sitting in the banking system. Why don't you just issue a certificate or a derivative on the portfolio of all the projects you want to do for your development, and then pay them what the real sector is paying. And let this be sold in the secondary market, have low denominations, or maybe 1,000, let's say, ringgit. What you do is, indeed, you enrich the middle class and the lower classes, because they can always buy this. Moreover, because they are buying into your projects, you improve governance, because now you have so many people who want to know what happened to their money. Because when you tax them, they don't care. They pay your taxes and then they let you do whatever you want. But if they have their savings in your hands and you're investing it, they want to know what happened to their money. So that improves governance. So no, they don't have to set a rate of interest. The government, then the bank, central bank, they can use these instruments to actually change or modify portfolio behavior of the private sector directly, not have to go through the financial sector. The minute they see that they need to do something, they can go to the secondary market and sell these instruments that the government issues. Just like they do with bonds, open market operations uses government bonds. They can use these certificates or these shares and then influence what the portfolio behavior of consumer and investors are doing.
So interest rates will not be a tool for managing the economy, in your perspective?
It's a rate of return to the real sector. That it would still be a very powerful and potent instrument. The reason it's potent is because you no longer go through a filter, which is the financial sector.
We have time for one more question. Yes.
When is the lunch? That's the next question.
Go.
Thank you for a fascinating talk and one that's really spanned a massive area of economics. There is clearly a discourse that happens in economics that sees Islamic principles as somehow very different from prudential principles. And I think you presented a very compelling argument that actually those differences are not fundamental differences, they're differences of practice. And I think you've also talked about a vision for how things might develop in the future. My question is really about what would be the forces that really drive change, because as you indicated in your answer to the previous question, there are some very substantial vested interests who would wish to protect the current set of arrangements. So how might this change take place?
Thank you for the question. Part of the problem is lack of communication, meaning the perception of what is Islam and what is Islamic finance is now making things very difficult for communicating. Among the Muslims themselves, I was addressing a group of people in Wall Street. They were fund managers. There were 200 of them. And they told me that a number which is given today unbelievable, that these people were actually managing that much money. I had none easier time to tell them the principles of Islamic finance as risk-sharing than I had Muslim bankers. The minute you say risk-sharing, they say, oh, my clients don't want to take risk. But this is not taking risk. Risk is taken in the real sector of the economy. It is the finance which you can do only three things with. You can transfer it, you can do it. You know, but my clients don't want it. I said, but clients want to make money. I'm trying to tell you, you can make more money. So what makes the difference is for me not to come and to say, oh, Allah will send you to hell, which is true. I'm not this is the most serious crime anybody can commit, because it says in the Quran that it calls for a war from Allah and His Prophet. I can't do that with somebody, because they say, okay, please open the door and leave, and the air blowing. But I can tell them, I can show them that if you can get 12%, why are you satisfied with only 6% net return? And your savers, why should they be satisfied with 2% but they can get 5%, 4%, double it? This is what I have to, this is the way we have to be able to explain to people. You know, there is ways actually in the Quran that the Quran says you can actually bribe people to believe and do the right thing. You know, there's one of the main objectives of zakat is to help people who don't believe in what you're doing. You know, actually give them, subsidize them. So this is bribe, but it's a halal bribe. Basically, because there's a group of people who are feeling sort of warm toward the idea of Islam, and you sort of give them some subsidies, give them some money, give them some gifts, make sure that they will start thinking positive. So what I'm saying that what we have to sell is not the idea of Islam, because guidance is in not my hand. Allah tells His Prophet, you cannot guide anybody whom you love to guide. I'm the one who's doing it. So therefore, what does Islam want? It's a universal religion. It says if you act this way, you're going to be better off. All I have to show is that if you do Islamic banking, you'll be better off. Your bottom line, which is finally what you're thinking about. Just give me a chance to explain to you. That chance I don't get very often.
Professor, I have a comment and a question. It's actually related to related to what you just said earlier regarding communication. I think the deeper issue here is getting a common reference point from an educational perspective, so that everyone talks from the same page, right? And this is where, when we have a divergence of views within Islamic finance itself, the challenge here has always been, how do you get common ground? In every Islamic finance event, all the leaders say, actually the differences are only 5 to 10% in terms of the views, and everyone is agreed on about 90% of things, the matter. The only thing is, how do you get people to read from the same script, right? And this is where I see personally the dearth of even quality talents coming through from all parts of the world, from Islamic banking and related courses, speaking the same particular language. Some of the courses have been Islamified, so to speak, so they're conventional courses with some Islamic perspectives, where there are courses also which have been built from the ground up from the Islamic banking and economic perspective. I think here, when you're talking about the talent issue, it's a real issue of getting the right leadership involved. And if you compare the glamour of conventional finance compared with Islamic finance, the conventional finance is going to almost always take the real cream of the crop away from the Islamic finance space. So what you're left with tends to be talents who are either fully interested and they are the cream of the crop, or talents who can't make it for the conventional finance space but and have to settle for the Islamic finance space. So here is where I think the problem is. We have a tough problem in terms of being able to speak on the same page for Islamic finance and not have such a divergence of views, which would confuse the market even further, especially the man on the street. What is your take on how we can actually come together and not fuse the views, but have a much more common understanding, and which would lead us to speak the same language for the man on the street?
Thank you for the question. Actually, the problem, as I said, basically is communication and perception of the people, and the only way you can change perception is through communication. And communication, of course, will come from you. This next generation, which is you, and all your colleagues, are the ones that are really my hope for explaining what Islamic finance is. When they say that it's the 95% agreement, it's a factual position, not on the economics of finance. Because if you ask any Islamic finance person, what is Islamic finance about? What will they tell you? It's about profit loss sharing, right? I mean, everybody said they accept profit loss sharing. They said, but listen, in order for you to decide on a profit loss sharing, you have to decide on a parameter on how you're going to share it. And this has to happen before you undertake the project. Because profit and loss is an ex post problem. You do that at the end of the project, you decide how to divide it. But you must decide earlier how it's going to be divided, so you won't have a fight at the end of the process. In other words, risk sharing. In order for you and I, we have a contract, we want to talk about it. You're providing money and I'm providing labor, and you tell me, let's decide how we're going to share the profit now. So, okay, you decide. The minute you start deciding, you have to think about expectations. What do you expect to get? That's the only time you can make a decision, to have some expectation of the returning money. That expectation is probability oriented. In other words, you expect to get this much for this probability. you are in the area of risk sharing. Risk sharing is antecedent to profit sharing. The problem is this is not understood, even by some of the professors don't understand this. That you can, they accept Islamic finance is about profit and loss sharing. But wait a minute, before you can do that, you have to have some arrangement about sharing the risk. Because this is going to happen in the future. Risk involves future decisions. If it is not about future, it's present, you don't have any problem. So you say, here is a pie, let's decide how we're going to share it. Even then, at the moment that you want to share, you have to decide. And that decision is boundless. So therefore, you're in the area of risk sharing. So most operatives in Islamic finance, even the very best of them, the best intention have a problem with this concept of risk sharing. So it's partly that. And I don't think one person can do that. It has to be basically young people who are already in the field and have been dedicating their life and time to it. It will take time because, as I said, we have only 30-year real operation. So I've been working for 45 years. And in this period, nobody actually listened to the truth. And it's just recently that this risk sharing is being now talked about. It will take time. You have a 450-year industry with glamour, as you said. And you have a 30-year industry which is really not very well known yet. But it is doing well. Even in its imperfect state, it's doing well. So we just have to be patient, and you, people, I'm talking about people like yourself, who have the energy, and alhamdulillah have devoted your life and time to it. For people like yourself and this generation who is studying Islamic finance, for you to understand it well, for yourself. As you know, Islam, just talking is not the thing. You have to also walk the talk, as they say. And you act that way. You act according to those principles. And everybody else follows. I'm really hopeful, very hopeful, for the next generation. Young people who have really devoted, not my boss there. For him, you know, you're one of those people that you were talking about in terms of teaching. Well, he's in a position that can teach you the right stuff. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Professor Dr. Christine, Professor Chugain, to please present Prof. Abbas a small token of our appreciation. Dr. Nafis, can you please? Thank you very much. You're all invited for lunch in KL 13. It's across on the other side of the reception.